The spark of arrogance. The morning sun filtered through the dense urban sprawl, painting long shadows on the cracked asphalt of the city streets. Commuters were already thick in traffic, the air alive with the sounds of honking horns and murmured frustrations. Among the chaos, a sleek, obsidian black luxury SUV stood out, a gleaming island of elegance amidst the grime. Its tinted windows reflected the world around it, shielding the identity of the driver within. Inside the vehicle sat Isabella Munro, a poised, striking woman in her late 30s. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, she exuded an air of calm authority. Her fingers, adorned with a single understated silver ring, gripped the leather steering wheel lightly. Isabella had places to be, and she was determined to be there on time, even if the traffic gods seemed to conspire against her. 2 lanes over, a police cruiser weaved aggressively through the congestion, its siren silent but lights flashing. Behind the wheel was Officer Gerald O'Connor, a man hardened by nearly 2 decades on the force. His uniform was crisp, but his demeanor was anything but. He carried himself with an air of superiority, his icy blue eyes scanning the traffic for his next target. Beside him, his rookie partner, Officer Damien Chen, squirmed uneasily in his seat, already accustomed to O'Connor's questionable tactics. "There," O'Connor muttered, pointing to Isabella's SUV. "Fancy car, dragging alone. Probably some spoiled trust fund kid or worse. Let's remind her whose streets these are." Chen hesitated. Sir, we don't have any reason to." O'Connor cut him off with a sharp glare. "Reason? You're still new, so let me teach you something. Half the job is keeping these people in check. Make them sweat a little." The cruiser swerved into Isabella's lane, pulling alongside her SUV. O'Connor gestured for her to roll down her window. Isabella, sensing the officer's intent, took a steadying breath. With deliberate precision, she adjusted her sunglasses, rolled the window down halfway, and turned to face him. "Yes, officer," she asked, her voice calm but firm. "License and registration." O'Connor barked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Is this your car, or did you borrow it?" Isabella arched an eyebrow, her face betraying no emotion. "This is my car," she replied evenly, handing over the requested documents. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" O'Connor smirked. "You're in no position to ask questions, sweetheart. Just sit tight." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a slap. Chen, visibly uncomfortable, opened his mouth to intervene, but O'Connor silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. Isabella's gaze didn't waver, her calm demeanor seemingly unshaken by the officer's growing hostility. O'Connor leaned closer to her window, his face inches from hers. "You're awfully quiet for someone in your position," he sneered. Isabella's lips curved into a faint, unreadable smile. "And what position is that, officer?" His smirk faltered for the briefest moment. There was something unnerving about her tone. Controlled, deliberate, and utterly unafraid. But O'Connor was not a man who backed down easily. He leaned even closer, his hand resting on the holster of his belt, as if to remind her of his authority. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" He spat. Before Isabella could respond, O'Connor did something that shocked even himself. In a fit of unchecked rage, he spat directly at her. The globule landed squarely on her cheek, a grotesque and deliberate act of degradation. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The bustling noises of the city faded into the background, leaving only the oppressive silence of the scene. Chen's eyes widened in disbelief, his body stiffening as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. Isabella didn't flinch. With a measured motion, she reached into her glove compartment, retrieved a packet of tissues, and wiped her face clean. Her expression remained calm, but her dark eyes burned with an intensity that made O'Connor take an involuntary step back. "Are you finished?" she asked softly, her voice devoid of anger, but brimming with something far more dangerous: certainty. O'Connor, emboldened by years of unchecked authority, sneered once more. "What are you going to do? Call someone. Isabella met his gaze evenly, her composure unnerving. She reached for her phone, tapped a few buttons, and held it to her ear. Yes, this is Isabella Monroe. I need internal affairs at my location immediately. O'Connor's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. What kind of game are you playing? Isabella didn't answer. She ended the call and replaced her sunglasses. You'll find out soon enough. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. But these weren't standard police sirens. They belonged to an internal affairs vehicle, sleek and unmarked except for the flashing lights. The arrival of the car sent a ripple of unease through the scene. Chen's face paled as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. O'Connor's bravado crumbled as 3 agents stepped out of the vehicle. Their commanding presence was unmistakable. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of authority, approached the scene. "Officer O'Connor," she began, her tone icy, "step away from the vehicle." "What's the meaning of this?" O'Connor blustered, trying to regain his composure. The agent ignored him and turned to Isabella. "Ms. Monroe, are you all right?" Isabella removed her sunglasses, revealing a face as composed as ever. "I am now." O'Connor's eyes darted between Isabella and the agent, realization dawning far too late. Who are you?" Isabella's gaze locked onto his, her voice steady and unyielding. "I'm Isabella Monroe, lead investigator for police misconduct in this city. And you, Officer O'Connor, have just made the biggest mistake of your life." The weight of her words hit like a hammer. The gathered onlookers murmured in shock, their whispers growing louder as the situation unfolded. O'Connor's confidence dissolved completely, replaced by a mix of panic and disbelief. Chen took a step back, distancing himself from his partner. He had seen enough to know that O'Connor's reign of unchecked arrogance was finally coming to an end. As the internal affairs agents took O'Connor into custody, Isabella watched with an unwavering gaze. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had suffered under the abuse of power that men like O'Connor wielded so carelessly. And she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. This was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, the sterile office of internal affairs buzzed with a quiet intensity. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh reflections on the polished metal surfaces of desks and file cabinets. Isabella Monroe sat at the head of a long table in a glass-walled conference room, her demeanor as composed as ever. She was no stranger to this environment. Here, justice wasn't just served. It was forged under pressure, with precision and purpose. Across from her sat Agent Danielle Carter, the lead investigator assigned to O'Connor's case. Carter was a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering determination. She regarded Isabella with a mix of respect and curiosity. Few people dared to challenge authority so boldly, let alone someone like O'Connor, a veteran officer known for his intimidation tactics. Carter tapped a pen against her notepad. "Ms. Monroe, you've given us enough to initiate disciplinary action against O'Connor, but I suspect there's more to this." "There always is," Isabella replied, her voice steady. "This isn't about one officer's lapse in judgment. It's a symptom of something systemic." Carter nodded. "Agreed. But we need more than a single incident to unravel something that deep. Do you have evidence of broader misconduct?" Isabella slid a thick folder across the table. "This is a preliminary file. Complaints, patterns of behavior, unexplained promotions, and questionable case closures. O'Connor isn't operating in a vacuum. He's part of a larger network." Carter opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. Her brow furrowed as she absorbed the data. "This is extensive. How long have you been compiling this?" "Months," Isabella said. "And it barely scratches the surface." Carter looked up, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know what you're walking into, don't you? These people won't go down quietly." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her gaze unflinching. "I didn't get into this line of work for peace and quiet." Meanwhile, across town, O'Connor sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, his face pale and drawn. The bravado he'd worn like a second skin had peeled away, leaving behind a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. Two internal affairs agents stood on either side of the room, their presence a silent reminder that his days of unchecked authority were over. The door opened, and Agent Carter stepped in, carrying Isabella's file. She placed it on the table and sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "Officer O'Connor," she began, her tone clinical, "you've been accused of misconduct during a traffic stop. That alone is enough to end your career. But what concerns us more is what this file suggests." O'Connor's eyes flicked to the folder, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Carter leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Don't insult my intelligence. We've reviewed your record. Complaints against you have mysteriously vanished. Promotions handed to you despite repeated incidents of excessive force. And now, thanks to Ms. Monroe, we have enough to start connecting the dots." O'Connor remained silent, his hands clenched into fists. Carter studied him for a moment before continuing. "You have a choice," she said. "Cooperate, and you might salvage what's left of your life, or stay silent, and you'll go down with the rest of them." For the first time, doubt flickered in O'Connor's eyes. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, and the weight of the evidence against him was crushing. "I want a lawyer," he muttered finally. Carter's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Of course you do." Isabella's investigation deepens. Later that evening, Isabella sat at her desk in her home office, a space meticulously organized yet brimming with energy. The room was lined with bookshelves, each filled with legal texts and case files. A corkboard on the wall displayed a web of connections, names, and photos pinned together with red string. This was her battleground, and she was in her element. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was Carter. "We've detained O'Connor," Carter said, "but he's clamming up. He asked for a lawyer." "Expected," Isabella replied. "He's protecting someone. The question is, who?" Carter hesitated. "We found something in his locker. A series of coded messages and a burner phone. The messages reference payments, case files, and some kind of operation. We're decrypting them now." "Good," Isabella said. "But we need more. These people thrive in the shadows. They'll try to bury this before we can expose them." "You're not wrong," Carter said. "We're already getting pressure from higher-ups to handle this quietly." Isabella's jaw tightened. "Let them try. I'm not stopping." After ending the call, Isabella returned to her desk. She sifted through a stack of papers, her mind racing. Each document represented a piece of the puzzle. A complaint ignored, a case mishandled, a life ruined. The deeper she delved, the clearer the picture became. O'Connor was part of a web of corruption that extended far beyond the police department. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight. Cautiously, she approached the door and looked through the peephole. A courier stood on her doorstep, holding an envelope. "Ms. Monroe?" he asked when she opened the door slightly. "Yes. This is for you," he said, handing her the envelope before walking away. Isabella closed the door and examined the envelope. It was unmarked, save for her name scrawled in block letters. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Back off. The network begins to react." The next morning, Isabella met with Carter and a small team of trusted allies at Internal Affairs. She showed them the note, her expression grim. "They know we're closing in," she said. "This isn't a warning. It's a threat." Carter nodded. "And it means we're onto something big." The team pored over the decrypted messages from O'Connor's phone. The messages referenced payments to key players, manipulation of evidence, and even the silencing of whistleblowers. One name appeared repeatedly: Commander Marcus Kane. Isabella's eyes narrowed. Kane was a respected figure in the department, known for his charisma and influence. But if the messages were accurate, He was also the mastermind behind the corruption. "We need to move carefully," Carter said. "Kane has powerful allies. If we make a wrong move, this entire investigation could collapse." Isabella leaned forward, her voice steady. "Then we don't give him the chance. We gather every piece of evidence we can and make it public. He won't be able to silence us if the entire city is watching." The stakes rise. As Isabella and the team worked tirelessly to build their case, the threats against her escalated. Her car was tampered with, forcing her off the road. Anonymous messages flooded her phone, each one more menacing than the last. But Isabella refused to back down. One night, as she worked late in her office, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Monroe," she said. A deep, gravelly voice responded. "You don't know who you're messing with. Back off, or you'll regret it." Isabella's grip on the phone tightened. "Is this Kane, or one of his lackeys?" The voice chuckled darkly. "You're playing a dangerous game, lady. Walk away while you still can." Isabella's lips curled into a determined smile. "I don't scare easily." She hung up and stared at the corkboard on her wall. The pieces were coming together, and she was closer than ever to exposing the truth. But the closer she got, the more dangerous the game became. And Isabella Monroe was ready for whatever came next. A web of deceit. The morning air was thick with tension as Isabella sat in a coffee shop on the east side of the city, a location carefully chosen for its proximity to anonymity. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the hushed conversations of patrons lost in their own lives. Isabella was anything but lost. Her focus was razor-sharp, her resolve hardened by the events of the past few days. Across the table sat Detective Elijah Marks, a man who had spent over a decade navigating the treacherous waters of law enforcement. He was an anomaly in a department plagued by corruption, a man driven by integrity and a burning desire for justice. Isabella had worked with him before, and she trusted him implicitly. If she was going to dismantle the network of corruption, she needed allies like Elijah. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Elijah said, his voice low as he sipped his coffee. His piercing green eyes scanned the room, always alert. "Good," Isabella replied, her tone unyielding. "They need to know their time is up." Elijah leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been digging into Commander Kane's background. He's got his hands in everything. Drug busts, property seizures, even political campaigns. And he's not doing it alone. He's got a whole web of officers, politicians, and business owners protecting him." Isabella nodded. "That matches what I found. O'Connor's burner phone had messages linking Kane to at least 3 major cover-ups. But we need more than circumstantial evidence. We need something irrefutable." Elijah set his cup down and slid a folder across the table. "I think I've got just that. The smoking gun." Inside the folder were photographs, financial records, and transcripts of wiretapped conversations. Elijah had managed to secure surveillance footage from an undercover officer who had been investigating Kane's operations before mysteriously disappearing. This officer, Sarah Delian, was working on a case involving Kane's ties to a drug cartel. Elijah explained. She was close to exposing him, but she vanished 6 months ago. Officially, the department ruled it a resignation. But unofficially, I think Kane had her silenced. Isabella's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the documents. The evidence was damning. Secret meetings, cash exchanges, and encrypted communications between Kane and high-ranking officials. "Does anyone else know about this?" she asked. Elijah shook his head. "Just you and me. I didn't trust anyone else with it." "Good," Isabella said. "We can't risk this getting out until we're ready to move." But even as she spoke, Isabella knew the danger they were in. Kane's reach extended far beyond the police department, and if he caught wind of their investigation, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate them. The city's dirty underbelly. Later that afternoon, Isabella met with Agent Carter at a secure location, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city that served as a makeshift command center for the investigation. The walls were lined with whiteboards and pinned documents, creating a visual map of the corruption they were trying to untangle. "Marx has given us a gold mine," Isabella said, handing Carter the folder. "But it's only the tip of the iceberg. Kane's network is bigger than we thought." Carter scanned the contents of the folder, her expression grim. "This is enough to get warrants, but if we go after him now, we'll tip our hand. He'll have time to cover his tracks." "We can't wait too long," Isabella countered. "The longer we wait, the more people he hurts. We need to strike a balance, build our case, but move quickly." Carter nodded. "Agreed. I'll get a team working on this, but you need to be careful. Kane's people are watching you." Isabella smirked. "Let them. I've faced worse." But her confidence didn't erase the weight of the threats looming over her. The note, the phone call, the tampered car, they were all reminders that Kane was willing to play dirty to protect his empire. The first crack. That evening, Isabella returned home to find her apartment in disarray. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers yanked open, and her computer smashed to pieces. It was a message, loud and clear: "Back off." She called Elijah immediately. "They've been here," she said, her voice tight with anger. "I'm on my way," he replied. When Elijah arrived, he assessed the damage with a grim expression. "This isn't just a warning. They're trying to intimidate you, make you feel vulnerable." Isabella clenched her fists. They picked the wrong person. "Even so," Elijah said, "you need to take precautions. I'll have someone from my team stay nearby in case they try anything else." As they cleaned up the mess, Isabella found a single photo placed deliberately on her desk. It was of Sarah DeLeon, the missing undercover officer. On the back was a handwritten note: "This is what happens to heroes." The message sent a chill down Isabella's spine, but it also fueled her determination. She wouldn't let fear control her. Sarah's disappearance was a stark reminder of what was at stake, and Isabella refused to let her become just another name in the long list of victims. Pushing forward. Despite the threats, Isabella and her team pressed on. They began compiling the evidence into a comprehensive case file, one that would be impossible to ignore. Carter coordinated with federal agencies, ensuring that their findings wouldn't be buried by local corruption. Elijah worked tirelessly to track down additional witnesses, including former officers who had left the force under mysterious circumstances. One such witness was Maria Torres, a retired officer who had been forced out after refusing to participate in a cover-up orchestrated by Kane. Isabella met her at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. "Why now?" Maria asked, her voice heavy with suspicion. "I've been sitting on this for years, and no one cared." "Because now we have a chance to make a difference," Isabella said. "Kane's empire is crumbling, but we need your testimony to finish the job." Maria hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her coffee. "If I do this, I'm putting a target on my back." "I won't let anything happen to you," Isabella said firmly. "But if we don't act, Kane will keep ruining lives. This is our chance to stop him." After a long pause, Maria nodded. "I'll do it." The turning point. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Isabella knew they were nearing a critical juncture. They had the evidence, the witnesses, and the support of federal agencies, but Kane wasn't going to go down without a fight. One night, as Isabella reviewed the case file in her office, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message. It was from an anonymous source. "Meet me at Pier 17. I have what you need." She hesitated. It could be a trap, but it could also be the key to bringing down Kane once and for all. With a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and headed out, her resolve unwavering. As she approached the pier, the salty air stung her nostrils, and the dim light of a single lamppost illuminated the desolate space. A shadowy figure stepped out from the darkness, holding a small USB drive. "You're Isabella Munro," the figure said, their voice muffled by a scarf. "This is everything you need to take Kane down." "Who are you?" Isabella asked. "Someone who's tired of living in fear," the figure replied before disappearing into the night. Isabella clutched the drive tightly, her heart pounding. Whatever was on it, she knew it would change everything. And she was ready. The turning tide. The USB drive sat in Isabella's hand like a weight, its cold metallic surface a stark reminder of the secrets it held. Back in her office, she plugged it into an encrypted laptop provided by Agent Carter. Her heart pounded as the files loaded, the screen illuminating the darkened room. A flurry of documents, spreadsheets, audio files, and video clips filled the screen. The data was overwhelming but compelling. Financial transactions, off-the-record meetings, surveillance footage, and conversations between Commander Kane and a network of officials and business leaders. It was a treasure trove of evidence, each file more damning than the last. One video caught her eye. The grainy footage showed Kane in a dimly lit room, seated across from a man Isabella recognized immediately, a prominent city councilman with a pristine public image. They were discussing payment for suppressing evidence in a drug bust gone wrong, a case that had resulted in the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. Her blood boiled. This wasn't just corruption. It was systemic abuse that destroyed lives. Isabella knew they finally had enough to make their move. But the question remained, how? Rallying the team. The next morning, Isabella called an emergency meeting with her closest allies. Agent Carter, Detective Elijah Marks, and Maria Torres sat around the table in the makeshift command center. Isabella's usually calm demeanor was replaced with an urgency that electrified the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm, "we have everything we need to take down Kane and his network. But this evidence won't mean anything if we can't control how it's revealed. We need a strategy." Elijah leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We can't just hand this over to the department or the local courts. Kane's got too many friends in high places. They'll bury it before it sees the light of day." Maria nodded. "What about the media? A public outcry could force the city's hand." Carter frowned. "That's risky. If we release this without coordination, it could backfire. We need to make sure the evidence isn't discredited or spun into something it's not." Isabella took a deep breath. "Then we'll do both. We'll prepare a press conference to release the most critical evidence while simultaneously filing it with federal authorities. That way, even if they try to suppress it locally, the federal agencies will be forced to act." The room fell silent as the weight of her plan sank in. It was ambitious and dangerous, but it was their best shot. The first blow. The team spent the next several days meticulously organizing the evidence into a cohesive narrative. Maria, with her first-hand knowledge of Kane's operations, helped connect the dots, while Carter ensured the files were legally admissible. Elijah worked tirelessly to locate more witnesses, convincing a few reluctant former officers to come forward. Meanwhile, Isabella prepared for the press conference. She knew the city would be watching, and she needed to deliver a message that was both powerful and irrefutable. Late one night, as she rehearsed her speech, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. "You think you're untouchable," the voice on the other end growled. "You're not. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Isabella's grip tightened on the phone. "You're scared," she said, her tone steady. "You should be." She hung up and returned to her preparations, more determined than ever. The press conference. The day of the press conference arrived, and the city was buzzing with anticipation. Reporters from every major outlet gathered in the courthouse plaza, their cameras trained on the podium where Isabella would speak. Behind her stood Carter, Elijah, and a handful of brave whistleblowers ready to support her publicly. As Isabella stepped up to the microphone, the crowd hushed. Her voice was clear and resolute as she began. "For too long, this city has been held hostage by corruption. Today, we're pulling back the curtain." She outlined the evidence, careful to present it in a way that was both compelling and undeniable. Then, she played the video of Kane's meeting with the councilman. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the damning footage unfolded. "This is just the beginning," Isabella continued. "We have submitted this evidence to federal authorities and will ensure that justice is served. No one is above the law." The press conference ended in chaos as reporters clamored for more information. But Isabella didn't linger. She knew the real battle was just beginning. Kane's counterattack. As expected, Kane didn't take the revelation lying down. That evening, Isabella received an urgent call from Carter. "Kane's people are mobilizing," Carter said. "They're trying to discredit you. Rumors are spreading about fabricated evidence and your alleged vendetta against the department." Isabella sighed. "Let them talk. The evidence speaks for itself." But the attacks weren't limited to smear campaigns. Isabella's home was vandalized again, and Maria received a chilling voicemail warning her to stay silent. Elijah reported that 2 of their witnesses had backed out, too afraid to testify. The pressure was mounting, but Isabella refused to give in. A glimmer of hope. Despite the obstacles, cracks began to form in Kane's empire. The press conference had ignited a firestorm, and public outrage was growing. Citizens organized protests, demanding accountability from the police department and city officials. Whistleblowers started coming forward in greater numbers, emboldened by Isabella's courage. Federal investigators arrived in the city, their presence a clear sign that the case was gaining momentum. Kane's allies in the department began distancing themselves, unwilling to go down with him. But Kane wasn't done yet. The betrayal. One night, as Isabella reviewed the case file with Elijah, her phone buzzed with a text message from an anonymous number. It was a photo of her and Elijah taken through the window of her office, accompanied by a single word: traitor. Her stomach turned. Someone close to them was leaking information. "Elijah," she said, showing him the message. "We have a mole." Elijah's expression darkened. "It has to be someone with access to our team." Carter joined them moments later, and they quickly realized the betrayal had come from one of the federal agents. The agent, a man named Richard Greaves, had been secretly working with Kane, feeding him information about their investigation. "We need to act fast," Carter said. "If Greaves warns Kane about our next move, we're finished." The raid. With the mole exposed, the team moved swiftly. Using the evidence on the USB drive, they secured warrants to raid Kane's properties and seize his assets. The operation was risky, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The raid unfolded in the early hours of the morning. Teams of officers, backed by federal agents, stormed Kane's luxurious mansion and several warehouses linked to his operations. The scene was chaotic. Kane's guards resisted, but they were quickly overpowered. Isabella stood outside the mansion as Kane was led out in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, she saw fear in his. "This isn't over," Kane snarled as he was loaded into a police van. "No," Isabella replied, her voice steady. "It's just beginning." The raid marked a turning point in the battle against corruption, but Isabella knew there were still challenges ahead. Kane's trial would be long and grueling, and the system he had built wouldn't crumble overnight. But for the first time, the tide was turning, and Isabella Monroe wasn't done fighting. The courtroom gambit. The courtroom was packed. Rows of journalists, onlookers, and city officials filled the wooden benches, their hushed whispers rising and falling like waves against the tension in the air. Isabella Monroe stood tall, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, her presence commanding. This was her battlefield now, and she was ready. At the defense table sat Commander Marcus Kane, his once unshakable arrogance reduced to a thin veneer of composure. His high-powered legal team whispered furiously among themselves, their confidence shaken by the mountain of evidence Isabella had brought against him. The presiding judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, rapped her gavel. "Court is now in session." Opening statements. The prosecutor, an experienced attorney named Victor Hartman, stood to deliver his opening statement. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a case that had gripped the city. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power, how it corrupts and how it destroys lives." Marcus Kane, a man entrusted to protect and serve, instead chose to exploit his position for personal gain, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. He gestured toward the jury, his tone growing more impassioned. Today, we will show you how Commander Kane abused his authority, conspired with criminals, and betrayed the trust of this city. The evidence is irrefutable, and by the end of this trial, the truth will be undeniable. Kane's lead defense attorney, Richard Lowell, rose to deliver the counterargument. His polished demeanor and sharp suit exuded confidence, but his words betrayed a sense of desperation. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is not about justice. It's about ambition. Ms. Isabella Munro, the so-called lead investigator, has orchestrated a witch hunt, twisting facts and misleading witnesses to serve her personal vendetta. Isabella's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She knew this attack was coming and had prepared for it. Lowell continued, "You will see that this case is built on shaky ground, riddled with inconsistencies and ulterior motives. Commander Kane is not a perfect man, but he is not the monster they paint him to be." Testimonies unfold. The first days of the trial were grueling. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting stories of bribery, intimidation, and outright criminal activity orchestrated by Kane. Each testimony painted a darker picture of the man who had once been a respected figure in the city's police force. Maria Torres was one of the key witnesses. She recounted the threats she had faced when she refused to falsify evidence in a case tied to Kane's network. "I was forced to leave the department because I couldn't live with myself," Maria said, her voice trembling. "But I'm here today because the truth deserves to be told." The defense tried to discredit her, digging into her past and questioning her motives, but Maria held her ground. Her courage set the tone for other witnesses who followed. The turning point. Midway through the trial, Isabella took the stand. The defense wasted no time launching into their line of attack. "Ms. Monroe," Lowell began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you've been accused of having a personal vendetta against Commander Kane. Isn't it true that you've clashed with him in the past?" Isabella met his gaze, her voice calm and measured. "It's true that I've encountered Commander Kane professionally. Our disagreements were always about one thing: justice." Lowell smirked. "And yet you've built a case so massive that it seems almost personal. Could it be that you're using this trial to settle old scores?" "No," Isabella said firmly. "This case isn't about me. It's about the people Commander Kane hurt, the victims of his corruption. Every piece of evidence, every witness, and every victim speaks to the truth. That's what this trial is about." Her words resonated in the courtroom, silencing the defense's attempts to undermine her credibility. Kane's desperation. As the trial progressed, Kane's legal team grew increasingly desperate. They attempted to shift blame onto lower-ranking officers, suggesting that Kane had been unaware of the corruption in his department. But their strategy unraveled when Detective Elijah Marks took the stand. Marks, calm and composed, provided detailed accounts of conversations he had overheard, meetings he had witnessed, and directives he had seen Kane issue. Kane wasn't just aware, Elijah said, his voice steady. He was the architect. He gave the orders, ensured loyalty through intimidation, and silenced those who opposed him. The defense's attempts to rattle him failed. Elijah's testimony was clear, concise, and damning. The key evidence. The climax of the trial came when the prosecutor introduced the files from the USB drive. The courtroom fell silent as a video was played, showing Kane meeting with a drug cartel representative in a warehouse. The audio captured every word, including Kane's promise to shield the cartel from law enforcement in exchange for payments. "This is irrefutable evidence," Victor Hartman said, addressing the jury. "It proves that Marcus Kane betrayed his oath, his department, and this city." The defense tried to argue that the footage was doctored, but forensic experts testified to its authenticity, dismantling their claims. Closing arguments. In his closing statement, Hartman delivered a powerful summation. "This trial has revealed the depth of corruption that Marcus Kane brought to our city. His actions weren't isolated incidents. They were calculated, systemic abuses of power. Today, you have the opportunity to hold him accountable. Justice is not just a concept. It's a responsibility. And today, that responsibility lies with you. Lowell's closing statement was equally impassioned, but lacked the substance needed to sway the jury. His arguments felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The city held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a trial that had captured the nation's attention. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed once again. Isabella sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. The foreperson stood, her voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Kane, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept, and a few sat in stunned silence. Kane's expression was a mix of fury and disbelief as the reality of his downfall sank in. Aftermath. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to celebrate the victory. Isabella stepped out to a sea of applause and flashing cameras. She addressed the crowd briefly, her voice filled with gratitude and determination. "This verdict is a victory, but it's only the beginning," she said. "The fight against corruption doesn't end here. It's a fight we must all commit to, every day. Together, we can rebuild trust and ensure that justice prevails." As she walked away, flanked by her allies, Isabella felt a sense of closure. The battle had been long and grueling, but justice had been served. Still, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. Kane's conviction was a step forward, but the system he had built wouldn't crumble overnight. There was more work to be done, more battles to fight, and Isabella Monroe was ready for them all. Rebuilding trust. The courtroom verdict was just the beginning. Outside the courthouse, the city buzzed with a mix of triumph and uncertainty. Commander Marcus Kane had been brought to justice, but the network of corruption he had nurtured for years remained a formidable presence. Isabella Monroe, the architect of his downfall, understood that dismantling one man's empire wouldn't immediately rebuild the public's trust. The press hounded her for days, seeking soundbites and statements. Despite her exhaustion, Isabella gave carefully measured interviews, always steering the narrative back to the systemic changes that were needed. "This isn't about me," she told a reporter during a televised segment. "It's about the people of this city, about restoring their faith in the institutions that are meant to protect them." Kane's conviction is a step forward, but there's still a long road ahead. Unfinished business. In the weeks following the trial, Isabella and her allies turned their focus to the broader corruption that Kane's network had fostered. Detective Elijah Marks, Agent Danielle Carter, and Maria Torres formed the core of a task force dedicated to rooting out the remaining bad actors in the department. Their first priority was revisiting cases that had been manipulated under Kane's watch. Innocent individuals who had been wrongfully convicted were identified, their cases re-examined with the help of a team of pro bono attorneys. The process was slow and grueling, but Isabella knew it was essential. One case, in particular, stood out: a man named Jamal Harris, who had been imprisoned for 10 years on a trumped-up drug charge. Kane had personally overseen the case, ensuring that evidence was fabricated to secure a conviction. Isabella worked tirelessly with Jamal's lawyer to gather the necessary proof to overturn his sentence. The day Jamal was released was bittersweet. He walked out of the prison gates, a free man, but his eyes carried the weight of the years stolen from him. "Thank you," he said to Isabella, his voice rough with emotion. "But what about the others? What about the people who didn't have someone like you fighting for them?" Isabella placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight for them too." Confronting the shadows. The task force's work wasn't without resistance. Former allies of Kane, still embedded within the department, launched a quiet campaign to discredit Isabella and her team. Anonymous tips led to baseless investigations, and whispers of conspiracy swirled in the media. One night, Isabella received an encrypted email. It contained a single line of text: "You're making enemies you can't afford to have." Attached was a surveillance photo of her entering her home. The message was clear: her enemies were watching. But Isabella didn't flinch. She forwarded the email to Carter, who immediately began tracing its origin. The investigation led them to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. There, they discovered a small group of officers who had been part of Kane's inner circle, now working to regroup and protect their interests. Armed with this intelligence, the task force executed a carefully coordinated raid, arresting the officers and seizing documents that further implicated others in the department. A city divided. The fallout from the raid sent shockwaves through the city. Public opinion was divided. Some hailed Isabella as a hero, a beacon of integrity in a time of darkness. Others, influenced by media outlets aligned with Kane's allies, painted her as a destabilizing force, accusing her of undermining law enforcement. One evening, as Isabella addressed a town hall meeting, the tension in the room was palpable. Citizens lined up to voice their concerns, some grateful for her work, others skeptical of her motives. A man in the crowd stood up, his voice tinged with anger. "You talk about justice, but what about the good officers who are being dragged down by this? My son is a cop, and he's afraid to do his job because of what you've done." Isabella met his gaze, her tone calm but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir, but let me be clear. The work we're doing isn't about targeting good officers. It's about holding those who abuse their power accountable. If we don't clean up the system, the good officers will always be overshadowed by the bad." Her words sparked a murmur of agreement, but the divide remained. Isabella knew that winning the hearts and minds of the people would take time. The personal cost. The pressure of the investigation took a toll on Isabella's personal life. Long hours and constant vigilance left little room for anything else. Friends she hadn't spoken to in months reached out, expressing concern for her well-being. One evening, as she sat alone in her office, a knock on the door startled her. It was Elijah, carrying a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine. "You look like you haven't eaten in days," he said, setting the food on her desk. Isabella managed a weak smile. "You're not far off." As they ate, the conversation turned personal. Elijah, usually guarded, opened up about his own struggles, how the job had strained his relationships and left him questioning his place in the department. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" he asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Every day," Isabella admitted. "But then I remember why I started this fight. If we don't do it, who will?" Elijah nodded, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "You're right. We can't stop now." A glimpse of hope. Despite the challenges, progress was undeniable. The task force's efforts led to the indictment of several high-ranking officials, and the department began implementing long-overdue reforms. Whistleblowers were given protection, and an independent oversight committee was established to ensure accountability. One morning, Isabella received an unexpected visitor at her office. It was Jamal Harris, the man she had helped free. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, holding out a small envelope. "This is for the work you're doing." Inside was a modest donation to a legal defense fund Isabella had set up for other wrongfully convicted individuals. The gesture moved her deeply, reminding her why she had chosen this path. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I did," Jamal replied, "because you gave me my life back. Now I want to help others do the same." The road ahead. Months turned into a year, and the city slowly began to heal. Trust in the police department wasn't fully restored, but it was growing. People saw Isabella not just as a crusader for justice, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. As she stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd gathered to celebrate the anniversary of Kane's conviction, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her here. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady. "Justice is not a destination. It's a process. And together, we will continue to fight for a city that serves and protects all its people." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy a testament to the impact of her work. Isabella knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. She had turned the tide, and now she was ready to face whatever came next.